we conclude this journey of our stewardship series in remembering, to remember that which God has given to us and to remember our covenant that we make as members of this community. That covenant which includes the tenets of prayer, presence, gifts, service, and witness in Christ. Pastor Becky and I have been sharing with you and teaching you about those tenets these last several weeks. And so today, we celebrate on this final day, which is Christ the King Sunday. Now, I don't know if you're aware of it, but Christ the King Sunday is for us as Christ followers, our Christian New Year. This is the end of the year. It's all over. It begins again starting this next week. We don't order our lives by the calendar, which goes from January to December, but rather we order our lives by Jesus and his life and love, his ministry, and the remembrance of the story of Jesus in our lives. And so on this Christ the King Sunday, we end that Christian year. The Christian year ordered the church for centuries, and it orders our lives and patterns, or so it should today. And so on this Christian year, this end of the Christian year, Christ the King Sunday, we celebrate the new year. And our year begins again with Advent, which is next Sunday. Yes, I know that may surprise or shock us. You mean I only have 4 weeks now till Christmas? Yes, indeed. Advent starts next Sunday. And so Advent begins the Christian year all over again. And then we journey through the birth of Christ, and then later we'll experience stories of the baptism of Jesus, and we'll go through the Lenten season and the story of the Passion, and through Easter and all of that. And that's what orders the practice of our lives. And so on Christ the King Sunday, our Christian New Year, we rejoice and give thanks that we are God's people and that God is our covenant God, and God has chosen us. And we celebrate that we might live into the wholeness and fullness of life. We mark the remembrance of all that has been, and we look ahead with great anticipation for what will be. Marks of remembrance are helpful, for they give us a connection to the passion and purpose that we live forward with, because they recall for us what was, and they celebrate the value and the meaning of that. As Stacy talked with the children, when they break those pieces of bread up and put them in the bowl, she and her girls, it reminds her not only of that great tradition, but reminds her of when her girls were children, small children, when she herself was a small child. It connects us, those remembrances, to something important, something valuable in the past. So the story that we read today is one that reminds us of how Joshua set up a remembrance for the Israelites. I want to talk with you about remembrances. I remember when I was serving in my first full-time appointment, I had the opportunity to celebrate Good Friday. Now that might seem a contradiction, because it's on Good Friday in the Lenten season that we remember the death of Jesus. We recall the gruesome content of that story. We mark those moments when he was arrested and tortured and beaten and hung on a cross. Doesn't seem very good, but we as Christ followers call it good, for we know that that was not the end of the story, but the beginning, and that Jesus on that day gave his life for as sacrifice for you and me, that we might have the fullness of life that we enjoy today. And we remember that on Good Friday. And the reason I often remember that is it was after one of the first Good Friday services that the senior pastor and I at Kankakee Asbury United Methodist Church celebrated, came up to us. His name was Phil Hayes, and Phil told us that he never really liked going to the Good Friday services. In fact, he often skipped them because it was so somber and it seemed such a downer in the midst of the great celebration of Easter. But he told me and Leah, after we had celebrated and done so in the way that we did, identifying it as a remembrance, not that we would grieve it, but that we would give thanks for the depth of the sacrifice of Jesus. It had been reinterpreted for Phil, and he said from that moment on he would always remember Good Friday, and he would remember that service, and he would celebrate Good Friday as we're called to as Christ followers. It was many years after that once I was appointed to Godfrey, was celebrating, if you will, Good Friday. And on that Good Friday service, I had something, and I'm going to pull it out here to share with you. At the Good Friday service, I gave out as a symbol, a remembrance, these rough-cut nails. Now, you may have some difficulty seeing that. Maybe you can on the screen. This rough-cut nail, when people came forward as a part of the service to leave their prayers on the altar, I had a bowl of these nails and laying on the altar and invited people to take up that nail and to hold on to it as a remembrance of the sacrifice that Jesus made for us on that Good Friday on Golgotha so many years ago. And there was a man in the congregation named Jim Diskin. And Jim took one of those nails quietly and walked away. And it was several weeks after that service. Easter had come and gone. We were into Pentecost. And he walked up to me one day and he reached into his pocket and he pulled his rough-cut nail out of his pocket. And they're gray, almost black, when they first come out of the box. And his was as shiny silver as it could be, much like this one. And he said it was like that because ever since that Good Friday service, he carried that nail in his pocket every day. And whenever he'd reach his hand in his pocket, he'd feel that. And when he did, he would often rub it between his thumb and fingers, as I have this one. And he'd rubbed it so much that it had turned nice silvery color. And Jim told me that he carries that after that moment every day because whenever he does, he remembers that Jesus gave his life as a sacrifice for him, that he might have life and live it to the full. There's something that can be valuable about symbols, signs of remembrance, about traditions and practices, that being just one of them. So in this story today, we hear that Joshua is given by God's instruction a remembrance of 12 stones to be gathered out of the Jordan River and then stacked up. And when those stones are stacked up after they've crossed through the Jordan, they're to be there as a remembrance for the children who will come after. And I love the way that it says, when your children ask about these stones, then you tell them. And what was it that they were to tell them? That God is faithful, that God provides and that God protects, and that God led them through that Jordan River and delivered them safely, just as he had for them when they crossed through the Red Sea running from the Egyptian army. Remembrances call to mind those wonderful stories of our past that connect us to the passion and the depth of our relationship with God and our walk with Christ for us. So I went back and I had to read earlier in the story what exactly transpired that they were remembering with these 12 stones. And with those stones, you'll see in chapter 3 that was this story of the Israelites crossing over the Jordan. But before that, God came to them and gave them instruction. In chapter 3, we read these things, and I'll just pick a few parts of it. So early in the morning, Joshua rose, and he set from the city with the Israelites. And they came to the Jordan, and there they camped before they crossed over. At the end of the 3 days, the officers went around the camp, and they commanded the people, when you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the priests, then you shall set forth from that place and follow it, so that you may know the way that you are going. You have not passed this way before. So what that first says is that the Ark of the Covenant, which was the symbol of the presence of God among the people, that the ark, that God would go before them and God would lead them, because they'd never been here before. They're just about ready to cross over into that promised land that they'd been journeying for 40 years to enter into. And now the day is upon them. They've not been there. They don't know what to do. They don't know where they are, but they can trust God. And the first instruction that they're given is this: follow. Follow it. That is the ark. Follow God. So the first thing that we're called to do in our remembrance, the Israelites were called when they saw those 12 stones stacked up, is they're to remember that God would lead them and that it was God who led them into the promised land. And they were called, therefore, to follow. And so they did. They followed. And then you read on and you get to the 13th verse and we hear these words. When then the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth, rest in the waters of the waters of the Jordan flowing from above shall be cut off, and they shall stand in a single heap. In other words, God, just like he did on that day at the Red Sea, is going to part the waters. They're going to stop and they're going to cross over on dry land, remembering the story of the Israelites when they left Egypt. But in order to do that, it says, and I love this part of the story, it says first that the priests had to go and actually stand in the water and put their feet in. And when they did that, they would then see the waters part. So the first instruction that God gives to us is follow. Follow God. Trust God where God would lead us. Rely on God wholeheartedly. And then secondly, to act. That's what the Israelites did, the priests. It says, when? Only after they stepped into the water did the waters part. They didn't stand back and wait for those waters. And that's in contrast, if you will, to the story of the Israelites when they left Egypt. There Moses stood and with his staff in his hand, and he held his arms up, and the waters parted, and then they went through. But here they had to step out into the waters in faith. They had to trust that what God said would happen, that the waters would part, and so they did. Follow God, trusting, and then step out in faith. When you do, then God responds. And that's the third thing we read about in verse 16. Then the people crossed over opposite Jericho. While all Israel was crossing over on dry ground, the priests who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan until the entire nation had finished crossing over the Jordan. Follow God, trusting where God would lead us. Act in faith. When we do, God then honors that act and responds. And then we will see the fullness of God's blessings unfold before us. In the course of this, when the Israelites were standing on the embankment, Joshua slowly surveys the landscape, and then turning towards all of the people, he gives them that bold instruction, go, stand in the water, and so they do. And the feet of the priests bearing the ark dipped to the edge of the water, and it was almost as if in that moment then a miracle began to take place. But it was only after the Israelites responded. So today we gather on this dedication and consecration Sunday, and I, as your pastor, ask you, follow God. Trust God where the Lord is leading us as a congregation and a community in the new year that is ahead of us. Let us seek that vision that God has for us. Let us hear it clearly and then walk where God would go. And when we do, when we take that action in faithfulness, God will bless us. Now, I know that we as a nation are facing a difficult time. We're in the second week now after an election that was challenging for us as a people. Some of us find ourselves on one side, others on the other. Some celebrating, many grieving. All of us questioning and wondering what the future holds. I stand before you as your pastor, not only for this church, but for us as a nation, calling us to trust God, to follow God where God would lead us, and to know that it is God ultimately on this Christ the King Sunday that stands as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords in our lives and in the world around us, no matter what the culture and our nation might do. God calls us to be those who stand faithfully in the troubled waters of life and step out in that faith and seek to be those who are reconciling one to another, and to be those who are sharing the light and love of God in contrast and in some ways in contradiction to the fear and hate of the world. God calls us to be faithful. to love, to be reconciled, and to serve. And when we do, then, as we see in the story that the stones reminded the Israelites of, then we will see God's faithfulness. You see, too often it seems to me that we regard faith as something that we encounter here and there instead of something that we can experience here and now. Not long ago, for example, there was a parishioner who remarked that she was having a difficult time somehow needing to find the faith to keep going. I did understand, I think, what she meant by that, of course, but what struck me about what her statement was saying was that she sort of described faith, as I think many of us do, as a possession. That we possess faith. That it's something that we need to find or something that we can lose rather than a process. You see, faith, though, is never something that we grasp, but it is something that grabs hold of us, ever awakening from within the possibilities of God's promises. When we trust God, when we step out in faith, then we will see faith. You see, faith is not something that we can claim or earn or take hold of. Faith instead is something that we can experience when we love, when we trust, when we hope. The Almighty's love is the same gift that was given to the Israelites that day so many centuries ago. It is the love that we receive today and remember, and it is the love that we're called to share. You see, faith is always more lifting our hands to God than it is placing our hands on God and taking hold of Him. Instead, holding our hands out and saying, God, here am I. Use me. Here am I. Let me be your servant.